The scorching afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the bustling downtown sidewalk, casting harsh shadows between the towering office buildings and busy storefronts. The air shimmered with heat waves rising from the concrete, creating a distorted view of the city's daily chaos. Pedestrians hurried past, their faces buried in phones or hidden beneath sunglasses, each person absorbed in their own world, oblivious to the drama about to unfold just steps away from the municipal courthouse. Near the corner of 5th and Main Street, a small folding table sat positioned carefully on the public sidewalk. Behind it stood a woman whose presence commanded attention even in the most casual setting. Nia Robinson moved with quiet confidence as she arranged handmade jewelry and small crafts on her modest display. Her dark skin glowed with a natural radiance despite the oppressive heat, and her hair was pulled back in an elegant twist that spoke of both practicality and style. She wore a simple but well-tailored sundress in deep navy blue, paired with comfortable flats that allowed her to stand for hours without complaint. To the casual observer, Nia appeared to be just another street vendor trying to make an honest living in the heart of the city. Her warm smile greeted each potential customer with genuine kindness, and her voice carried a melodic quality that drew people in. Children stopped to admire the colorful beaded bracelets while their parents examined the intricate earrings and pendants. Nia's hands moved gracefully as she explained the craftsmanship behind each piece, her knowledge evident in every word she spoke. What none of the passing strangers knew was that this woman, selling handmade jewelry on a street corner, held one of the most powerful positions in the city's judicial system. Nia Robinson was the chief municipal judge overseeing arraignments, a role that placed her at the heart of the criminal justice system. Every morning, she sat behind the bench in courtroom 3A, making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. Police officers, attorneys, and court personnel showed her the utmost respect, aware of her reputation for fairness, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to justice. But today, she had chosen to step away from the marble halls and mahogany paneling of the courthouse to spend her Saturday supporting her sister's small business venture. The jewelry wasn't hers to sell, but her sister Keisha had fallen ill with the flu, leaving the weekend market stall unmanned. Without hesitation, Nia had volunteered to take her place, seeing it as an opportunity to connect with the community she served in a different capacity. The irony wasn't lost on her that she stood just 3 blocks from the courthouse where she wielded considerable authority, yet here she was simply another black woman trying to make $1 on the street. The contrast felt surreal, but it also felt important. These moments of anonymity allowed her to see the world through different eyes, to understand the experiences of people who might never set foot in her courtroom except as defendants. As the afternoon wore on, a small crowd had gathered around her table. A young mother examined a pair of silver earrings while her toddler reached for the shiny objects with sticky fingers. An elderly gentleman asked detailed questions about a leather bracelet, clearly impressed by the quality of the craftsmanship. Nia handled each interaction with the same patience and professionalism she brought to her judicial duties, though few would have connected this friendly vendor with the intimidating figure who presided over morning arraignments. The peaceful atmosphere was shattered by the screech of tires as a police cruiser pulled up to the curb with unnecessary aggression. The vehicle's door slammed shut with a metallic bang that caused several pedestrians to jump and look around nervously. Officer Derek Hayes emerged from the driver's seat, his imposing frame casting a long shadow across the sidewalk. His uniform was pristine, every button and badge polished to a mirror shine, but his demeanor radiated an arrogance that made people instinctively step away. Hayes was a 15-year veteran of the force, a man who had built his career on the assumption that his badge gave him unlimited authority over anyone he deemed suspicious or unworthy. His pale complexion was flushed with the heat, and his cold blue eyes swept over the scene with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up its prey. He had received a complaint about unauthorized vendors, though the truth was that the complaint had been vague and possibly fabricated. It didn't matter to Hayes. He saw an opportunity to flex his authority, and he intended to take it. The customers around Nia's table began to sense the shift in atmosphere. The young mother gathered her child closer, while the elderly gentleman stepped back, his eyes darting between the officer and the vendor. The easy chatter and laughter that had filled the air just moments before died away, replaced by an uncomfortable tension that seemed to press down on everyone present. Hayes approached the table with deliberate, heavy steps, his hand resting casually on his belt where his radio and other equipment created an intimidating display of authority. His eyes locked onto Nia, and she could see the assumptions forming behind his gaze. To him, she wasn't a person with a story or a life beyond this moment. She was simply another street vendor who needed to be put in her place. "Ma'am," Hayes said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. There was no warmth in the greeting, no acknowledgement of her humanity. "You got a permit for this little operation?" Nia looked up from arranging a display of necklaces, her expression calm but alert. She had dealt with difficult situations before, both in her professional and personal life, and she understood the importance of remaining composed. "Good afternoon, officer," she replied, her voice steady and respectful. "Yes, I have all the necessary permits right here." She reached for a small folder tucked beneath the table, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid any actions that might be misinterpreted. Inside were not only the proper permits for street vending but also documentation that would have immediately identified her true position. However, she chose not to reveal her identity just yet, curious to see how this interaction would unfold when she was viewed simply as a black woman selling jewelry on the street. Hayes barely glanced at the permits she handed him, his mind already made up about the situation. He flipped through the papers with obvious disdain, as if the very act of examining them was beneath his dignity. "These look suspicious to me," he declared, though anyone with basic reading skills could see that the documents were legitimate and properly notarized. The remaining customers began to disperse, uncomfortable with the escalating tension and unwilling to become involved in what was clearly becoming a confrontational situation. Nia watched them go with a mixture of understanding and sadness. She knew that many people, regardless of their personal feelings about justice and fairness, would choose to avoid conflict with law enforcement rather than risk becoming targets themselves. "Officer, I assure you that everything is in order," Nia said, maintaining her professional composure despite the obvious hostility radiating from Hayes. "The permits are valid, the location is approved for street vending, and I'm operating within all posted guidelines." Hayes dropped the permits on the table, not caring that a slight breeze scattered some of the papers toward the street. His actions were deliberate, designed to establish dominance and humiliate the woman he saw as just another troublemaker. "Don't get smart with me, lady," he snarled, stepping closer to the table in a move clearly intended to intimidate. The physical proximity was uncomfortable and unnecessary, a classic intimidation tactic that Nia recognized from countless cases that had come before her bench. She had seen this behavior pattern described in police reports and victim statements, but experiencing it firsthand brought a new level of understanding to the fear and helplessness that citizens felt when confronted by abusive authority. "I'm not being smart, officer," Nia replied, her voice remaining level despite the growing tension. "I'm simply trying to operate a legitimate business in accordance with city regulations." Hayes's face reddened, whether from the heat or from anger, it was impossible to tell. "You people always have an excuse," he said, the words dripping with barely concealed racism. "Always trying to work the system, always thinking you can get away with whatever you want." The comment hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning the entire interaction and revealing the true nature of Hayes's motivations. This wasn't about permits or regulations. This was about power, prejudice, and a man who had spent years believing that his badge gave him the right to treat certain citizens as less than human. Nia felt a familiar fire ignite in her chest. the same passion for justice that had driven her through law school and onto the bench. But she also felt something else, a deep sadness for a system that allowed people like Hayes to wear the uniform and carry the authority of law enforcement. Every day in her courtroom, she worked to ensure that justice was blind, that every person received fair treatment regardless of their race, economic status, or background. Yet here she stood, being judged and mistreated based solely on the color of her skin and her perceived social status. "I'm going to need you to pack up this junk and move along," Hayes continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "And next time, maybe think twice before you try to set up shop where you don't belong." The implication was clear, and it struck Nia like a physical blow. According to Hayes, she didn't belong in the downtown area, didn't belong on the public sidewalks that her tax dollars helped maintain, didn't belong in the community where she had lived and worked for over a decade. The irony was staggering. She belonged in these streets more than most people, not just as a citizen, but as someone who had dedicated her career to upholding the law that Hayes was now distorting to serve his own prejudices. "Officer, I have every right to be here," Nia said, her patience beginning to wear thin despite her best efforts to remain calm. "The permits are valid, the location is legal, and I'm not disturbing anyone or blocking traffic." Hayes stepped around the table, positioning himself uncomfortably close to Nia in a clear violation of personal space. His hand moved to rest on his radio, a subtle but unmistakable threat that he could call for backup if she continued to resist his unlawful orders. "Are you arguing with me?" he demanded, his voice rising to a level that drew the attention of pedestrians half a block away. "Because it sounds like you're arguing with a police officer, and that's never a smart move for someone in your position." The threat was implicit but clear. Hayes was suggesting that her position as a black woman made her particularly vulnerable to police retaliation. It was a tactic designed to remind her of her supposed place in the social hierarchy and to make her submit to his authority through fear rather than respect for legitimate law enforcement. But Nia Robinson had not spent years fighting for justice in courtrooms across the state to be intimidated by a racist officer on a power trip. She straightened her shoulders, drawing herself up to her full height, and met Hayes's glare with steady, unwavering eyes. "I'm not arguing, officer," she said, her voice carrying a strength that seemed to surprise him. "I'm exercising my constitutional rights as a citizen to conduct lawful business in a public space. If you believe I'm violating any laws, I'm happy to discuss this matter through proper legal channels." The mention of legal channels seemed to strike a nerve with Hayes. His jaw clenched and his hands balled into fists at his sides. He had expected easy submission, the kind of fearful compliance that had characterized too many of his previous interactions with citizens he viewed as beneath him. Instead, he was facing a woman who knew her rights and wasn't afraid to assert them. "Legal channels?" Hayes laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Lady, I am the legal channel. What I say goes, and what I'm saying is that you need to pack up this garbage and get out of here before I decide to run you in for obstruction." The escalation was rapid and frightening. What had begun as a routine question about permits had transformed into a power struggle fueled by racial prejudice and Hayes's inability to accept that his authority could be questioned. Nia realized that the situation was spiraling beyond her control, not because of anything she had done wrong, but because Hayes was determined to assert his dominance regardless of the law or common decency. She began to carefully gather her sister's jewelry, not because she accepted Hayes's unlawful order, but because she recognized the danger of the situation. She had seen too many cases where encounters like this escalated into violence, and she wasn't willing to risk her safety or her sister's merchandise for the sake of making a point. There would be other ways to address this injustice, proper channels through which Hayes could be held accountable for his behavior. But Hayes wasn't satisfied with her compliance. He had worked himself into a state of righteous indignation, convinced that he was dealing with another troublemaker who needed to be taught a lesson. As Nia bent to fold the table, He grabbed her arm roughly, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to leave bruises. "Not so fast," he snarled, his grip tightening when she tried to pull away. "Maybe a night in lockup will help you remember how to show proper respect to law enforcement." The assault was sudden and shocking. Nia felt the pain shoot up her arm as Hayes's grip tightened, and she instinctively tried to pull away from his grasp. The movement was natural, the kind of reflexive response anyone would have to unwanted physical contact, but Hayes interpreted it as resistance. "Don't you dare try to pull away from me," he shouted, his voice echoing off the surrounding buildings. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting arrest." The charges were fabricated, built on nothing more than Hayes's wounded pride and racial prejudice. Nia had done nothing wrong, had committed no crime other than existing as a black woman in a space where Hayes didn't think she belonged. But she found herself being roughly turned around, her arms pulled behind her back as Hayes fumbled for his handcuffs. The metal cuffs clicked into place with a sound that seemed to echo through the streets. They were tight, tighter than necessary, cutting into Nia's wrists and sending sharp pains up her arms. She could feel the curious stares of passers-by, some stopping to watch the spectacle while others hurried past, unwilling to become involved in what they perceived as just another arrest. "This is illegal detention," Nia said, her voice strained but still carrying the authority that came from years of legal training. "I have committed no crime and you have no probable cause for this arrest." Hayes pushed her roughly toward the patrol car, his hand heavy on her shoulder. "Tell it to the judge, sweetheart," he said with a cruel smile. "Maybe she'll be more impressed with your legal knowledge than I am." The irony of his words would have been laughable under different circumstances. Hayes had no idea that he was arresting the very judge he was referring to, the woman who would normally preside over cases like this one. But at that moment, Nia felt only the humiliation of being treated like a criminal, the pain of the too tight handcuffs, and the burning injustice of a system that allowed officers like Hayes to abuse their power with impunity. As she was loaded into the back of the patrol car, her sister's jewelry scattered on the sidewalk and her permits blowing in the wind, Nia Robinson understood with crystal clarity why so many people had lost faith in the justice system. The very system she had devoted her life to protecting had failed her in the most fundamental way possible. But Hayes had made one crucial mistake. He had assumed that she was powerless, just another black woman who could be pushed around without consequences. What he didn't know was that he had just arrested one of the most powerful figures in the city's judicial system, and that his career was about to come to a very abrupt end. The patrol car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind a scattered mess of jewelry and paperwork, but more importantly, leaving behind witnesses who had seen a clear abuse of police power. The seeds of Hayes's destruction had been planted, and they would grow into a reckoning that would shake the entire department to its core. As the downtown streets flashed past the patrol car windows, Nia sat in dignified silence, her mind already working through the legal strategies that would bring Hayes to justice. She had been humiliated, assaulted, and falsely arrested, but she was far from defeated. In fact, Officer Derek Hayes had just made the biggest mistake of his career. The interior of the police station felt like stepping into a different world, one where the rules of civility and human dignity seemed suspended in favor of cold efficiency and bureaucratic indifference. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glow over the gray linoleum floors and institutional green walls. The air carried the unmistakable scent of disinfectant mixed with fear and desperation, a combination that had soaked into the very foundations of the building over decades of processing criminals, suspects, and now innocent citizens caught in the web of police misconduct. Officer Derek Hayes marched Nia through the station with the swagger of a man who believed he had just scored a significant victory. His chest was puffed out with pride, and he nodded to his colleagues with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully put another troublemaker in her place. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man with tired eyes and 25 years on the force, barely looked up from his paperwork as Hayes approached with his prisoner. Nia maintained her composure as she was processed, though every step of the procedure felt like another layer of humiliation piled onto an already outrageous situation. The booking process was designed to strip away dignity, to reduce human beings to numbers and categories in a system that valued order above justice. She had overseen thousands of these procedures from the judicial side, but experiencing it firsthand gave her a new appreciation for the dehumanizing effect it had on everyone who passed through these doors. "Name," the desk sergeant said without looking up, his fingers poised over a keyboard that had seen better days. "Nia Robinson," she replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Address." She provided the information requested, answering each question with the precision that came naturally to someone accustomed to legal proceedings. But she noticed that Hayes was hovering nearby, occasionally interjecting with editorial comments about her attitude and disrespectful behavior. Each lie he told was carefully cataloged in her mind, building the case that would eventually destroy his career. The fingerprinting process was particularly degrading. The ink was cold against her skin, and the officer handling the procedure treated her like an object rather than a human being. Her fingers were pressed against the scanner with unnecessary force, and she was ordered to look straight ahead for the booking photo with the same tone someone might use to command a dog. But the most insulting moment came when Hayes decided to embellish his story for the benefit of his colleagues. As Nia sat in the holding area, still handcuffed and waiting for the next step in the process, she could hear him regaling other officers with his version of events. "You should have seen this one," Hayes said, his voice carrying easily across the open space of the booking area. "Typical street vendor, probably illegal, definitely attitude problem. Had some fake permits, tried to give me the runaround about her rights and legal this and legal that." The other officers laughed, the sound grating against Nia's ears like fingernails on a chalkboard. She understood that this was part of the culture that allowed abuse to flourish. Officers covered for each other, shared stories that painted their victims as deserving of mistreatment, and created an echo chamber where misconduct was not only tolerated but celebrated. "Did she try to run?" asked a younger officer, clearly eager to hear more details of the encounter. Hayes shook his head, a smug smile spreading across his face. "Nah, but she got physical when I tried to arrest her, started pulling away, trying to resist. Had to use appropriate force to get her under control." The lie was so blatant, so completely divorced from reality, that Nia felt a moment of genuine shock. She had not resisted in any way beyond the natural human response to unwanted physical contact. Hayes had been the aggressor from the moment he grabbed her arm, but now he was rewriting history to make himself the hero of his own twisted narrative. "These people never learn," said another officer, an older man with sergeant's stripes who should have known better. "Think they can just set up shop wherever they want, cause problems for law-abiding citizens." "Exactly," Hayes agreed, his voice rising with false righteousness. "That's why we have to stay on top of this kind of thing. Can't let them think they can get away with it." The casual racism in their conversation was stunning in its openness. These were sworn officers, men who had taken an oath to serve and protect all citizens regardless of race or background. Yet they spoke about these people as if they were discussing a pest control problem rather than human beings with rights and dignity. Nia closed her eyes and took a deep breath, drawing on the meditation techniques she had learned during her years of dealing with high-stress legal situations. She needed to remain calm, to think clearly about her next moves. The anger burning in her chest was justified, but it wouldn't help her navigate the challenges ahead. The holding cell was small and cramped, with concrete walls painted an institutional beige that had faded to an unpleasant yellow over the years. A single bench ran along one wall, and a stainless steel toilet sat in the corner, offering no privacy for anyone unfortunate enough to need it. The floor was scuffed linoleum, marked with the passage of countless feet and countless stories of injustice. As Nia sat on the hard bench, her wrists still aching from the handcuffs that had finally been removed, she reflected on the surreal nature of her situation. Just hours earlier, she had been in her chambers at the courthouse, reviewing cases and preparing for the upcoming week. Her law clerk had briefed her on several interesting constitutional issues that were coming before the court, and she had been looking forward to the intellectual challenge they would present. Now she found herself on the other side of the system she had devoted her life to serving, experiencing firsthand the degradation and injustice that too many citizens faced every day. The irony was not lost on her that she regularly presided over cases involving police misconduct, that she had sent officers to disciplinary hearings and recommended changes in department policies based on patterns of abuse she had observed from the bench. But knowing about injustice from a judicial perspective and experiencing it personally were two entirely different things. The helplessness she felt, the way the system ground forward regardless of truth or innocence, the casual cruelty of officers who saw citizens as enemies rather than people they had sworn to protect, all of it took on a new and terrible clarity when viewed from inside a holding cell. The sound of footsteps in the corridor broke her contemplation, and she looked up to see a familiar face approaching her cell. Detective Andre Coleman was someone she knew well from his frequent appearances in her courtroom. He was one of the good ones, a black detective who had earned respect through competence and integrity rather than by playing along with the department's more toxic elements. Andre stopped in front of her cell, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. He clearly recognized her, though it took a moment for the reality of the situation to sink in fully. When it did, his face went through a rapid series of emotions. Surprise, confusion, and finally, a dawning horror as he began to understand what had happened. "Judge Robinson," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "What in the hell are you doing in here?" Nia stood and approached the bars, keeping her voice low as she explained the afternoon's events. Andre listened with growing disbelief, his jaw tightening as she described Hayes's behavior and the fabricated charges that had led to her arrest. "This is insane," Andre muttered, running a hand over his face. "Hayes arrested you for selling jewelry with proper permits, and then made up charges about resisting arrest?" "That's exactly what happened," Nia confirmed. "He saw a black woman selling jewelry and decided I didn't belong there. When I didn't immediately submit to his unlawful orders, he escalated the situation and eventually assaulted me." Andre looked around again, clearly troubled by what he was hearing. As a detective, he had seen enough police misconduct to know that Nia's story was entirely plausible. Hayes had a reputation among the more ethical officers as someone who pushed boundaries and treated citizens, particularly people of color, with unnecessary aggression. "Judge, I need to ask you something, and please don't take this the wrong way," Andre said carefully. "Why didn't you identify yourself? Why didn't you tell Hayes who you are?" It was a fair question, and one that Nia had been asking herself since the arrest began. "I wanted to see how the system would treat me as just another citizen," she said. "I've been presiding over these cases for years, but I realized I didn't truly understand what people go through when they encounter officers like Hayes." Andre nodded slowly, understanding the logic but also recognizing the dangerous position it had put her in. "Judge, you need to know that this is going to be a problem for Hayes. A big problem. When word gets out that he arrested you, the chief municipal judge, heads are going to roll." "Good," Nia said firmly, "because this isn't just about me. This is about every person who has been mistreated by officers like Hayes, every citizen who has been judged by the color of their skin rather than their actions. If my arrest can shine a light on this problem and help fix it, then maybe some good will come from this nightmare." Andre looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. He understood her motivations, respected her commitment to justice, but he also knew that what she was proposing would create waves that would rock the entire department. "The thing is, Judge," Andre said carefully, "Hayes is already processing the paperwork. He's listing you as Jane Doe pending identification, which means he either doesn't know who you are or he's deliberately hiding your identity to avoid the fallout. This information was troubling but not surprising. Hayes was clearly intelligent enough to understand that arresting a sitting judge would have serious consequences for his career. By processing her as an unidentified suspect, he was buying time and possibly hoping that the charges could be quietly dropped before anyone important found out what had happened. "How long can he keep me here without proper identification?" Nia asked. "Legally? Not long, but in practice, weekend bookings can sometimes sit until Monday before anyone reviews them carefully. If Hayes is smart, he'll try to get you released tomorrow with charges dropped, hoping you'll just let the whole thing slide." Nia's eyes flashed with determination. "He's not that smart, and I'm definitely not letting this slide." Before Andre could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor. Hayes appeared, his expression shifting from confident to uncomfortable when he saw Andre talking with the prisoner. There was clearly no love lost between the two officers, and Hayes seemed suspicious of Andre's interest in what should have been a routine arrest. "Coleman," Hayes said, his tone carefully neutral, "what are you doing down here? This isn't your case." Andre straightened, his detective instincts kicking in as he studied Hayes's body language and tone. "Just checking on the weekend bookings, Hayes, making sure everything's being handled properly." Hayes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Everything's fine. Just another street vendor who thought she could cause problems for working officers. Nothing that concerns CID." The Criminal Investigation Division was Andre's department, and Hayes was technically correct that a simple obstruction case wouldn't normally fall under their jurisdiction. But Andre's interest wasn't professional. It was personal, based on his respect for Judge Robinson and his growing suspicion that Hayes had made a catastrophic error in judgment. "Right," Andre said, his tone giving nothing away. "Well, make sure you follow proper procedures. We don't want any complaints about mistreatment or violations of rights." Hayes bristled at the implied criticism, but he couldn't challenge Andre directly without revealing more about the case than he wanted to. "I always follow procedures, Coleman. Maybe you should worry about your own cases instead of second-guessing patrol officers." The tension between the two men was palpable, and Nia watched the exchange with fascination. She was seeing the internal dynamics of the police department from a perspective she had never had before, understanding how the good officers like Andre had to navigate around the problematic ones like Hayes. After Hayes left, Andre returned to Nia's cell with a concerned expression. "Judge, I think you need to know that Hayes is going to try to bury this. He's going to process you as quietly as possible and hope it all goes away." "What do you suggest?" Nia asked. Andre looked around again, then pulled out his cell phone. "I suggest you let me call someone who can get you out of here tonight. Your lawyer, maybe, or someone from the court administration." Nia considered the offer for a moment, then shook her head. "No. I want to see how this plays out through normal channels. I want to experience exactly what any other citizen would go through in this situation. Judge, with respect, that's not a good idea. The weekend shift is minimal, and you could be stuck here until Monday morning if Hayes decides to be vindictive." "Then I'll be stuck here until Monday morning," Nia said firmly. "Andre, I appreciate your concern, but this is bigger than just getting me out of jail. This is about understanding the system from the inside and making sure that what happened to me today doesn't happen to anyone else." Andre shook his head, clearly frustrated with her decision but understanding her reasoning. "All right, Judge, but I'm going to be keeping an eye on things, and if Hayes tries anything else inappropriate, I'm going to make sure it gets reported through proper channels." "Thank you, Andre. That means more than you know." As the detective walked away, Nia settled back onto the hard bench and prepared for what she knew would be a long night. The concrete walls seemed to close in around her, and the sounds of the station continued. Phones ringing, officers talking, the occasional shout from other holding cells. But she found a strange peace in her decision to see this through. She thought about all the defendants who had stood before her bench over the years, people who had experienced this same degradation and fear before appearing in her courtroom. How many of them had been innocent? How many had been victims of officers like Hayes who saw badges as licenses to abuse rather than tools to serve and protect? Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new humiliations, and eventually a reckoning that would shake the police department to its core. But tonight, Chief Municipal Judge Nia Robinson would spend her time in a holding cell, gaining an education in injustice that no law school could provide. Outside, the city continued its normal rhythm, unaware that one of its most powerful judicial officers was sitting in a jail cell, planning a revolution in the way justice was administered. Hayes thought he had won, that he had put another troublemaker in her place. What he didn't realize was that he had just declared war on the very system he claimed to serve, and that war was about to be waged by someone with the power and knowledge to win it decisively. The holding cell grew colder as the hours dragged on, its concrete walls soaking up the warmth from the bodies inside and radiating back only dampness and chill. Fluorescent lights flickered in the corridor beyond, buzzing faintly with a sound that made silence impossible. It was the kind of noise that gnawed on nerves, low, persistent, like a reminder that sleep would never come. Nia Robinson sat upright on the narrow bench, arms crossed, her posture immaculate despite the discomfort. It was instinct more than choice. She had trained herself, through years on the bench, never to slump, never to shrink, never to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her diminished. Tonight, in a beige cell that stank faintly of disinfectant and fear, that discipline was the only armor she had left. She closed her eyes briefly, only to be interrupted by the echo of boots striking tile. The rhythmic stomp of an officer escorting a new arrival reverberated through the corridor. A key rattled, a door clanged, and another human being was pushed into holding. The routine was the same each time. Names shouted, charges barked, someone crying, someone cursing. Nia had presided over countless arraignments that began with these noises, but from her bench the sounds were distant, abstract. From here they were raw and intimate. Every clang of steel, every scrape of the bench felt personal. Around midnight, the door opened again, and a young woman stumbled in. She couldn't have been older than 22. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, mascara smudged into dark half-moons beneath swollen eyes. She wrapped her arms around herself as though her own body were the only thing holding her together. She was placed in the cell directly across from Nia and sank onto the bench without a word. For a long moment, the young woman just cried softly, shoulders shaking with the quiet desperation of someone who didn't know how their life had veered so violently off course. Nia watched her, her heart tightening. She had seen hundreds of defendants come into her courtroom in this same state, broken down by humiliation before their cases even began. But it was different to share the same cold space, to feel the sharpness of that despair in the air around her. Finally, Nia spoke, her tone gentle. "First time?" The girl looked up, startled. Her eyes were wide, raw with confusion and fear. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand and nodded. "Yeah, first time. I don't even know what I did." "What did they charge you with?" Nia asked carefully, her judge's instinct taking over even now. The girl swallowed, her voice thick. "Prostitution. Said I was soliciting, but I wasn't. I swear I wasn't. I was just walking home from work. The bus stops 3 blocks from where they stopped me. I didn't even say anything to anybody. He just looked at me and decided." Nia's jaw clenched. She had seen this pattern far too many times. Young women, often poor, often black or brown, scooped up on vague charges built more on assumptions than evidence. Arrests justified after the fact with broad language about suspicious behavior. It was a practice she had condemned from the bench, but here was its human cost, sitting across from her with tears drying on her cheeks. "What's your name?" Nia asked softly. "Tasha," the girl whispered. "Tasha Brown." "Well, Tasha," Nia said gently, "you didn't deserve this, and I believe you. Hold on to that. Don't let them convince you otherwise." Tasha's eyes searched Nia's face, puzzled. "Why are you here? You don't look like the kind of woman they usually bring in here." Nia gave a faint, humorless smile. Because sometimes the system doesn't care who you are. Sometimes all it sees is what it wants to see. Today it looked at me and decided I didn't belong on a sidewalk. Tasha nodded slowly, her lip trembling. That's exactly how it felt, like I didn't belong. The two women fell into silence, the shared experience speaking louder than words. Across the hall, another prisoner groaned in his sleep. From down the corridor came the faint sound of an officer's laughter, sharp, mocking, cruel. It made Nia think of Hayes again, of his smirk, his grip on her arm, the relish in his voice when he told her to pack up her junk. She shifted on the bench, her wrists still raw where the cuffs had cut into her skin. She thought about all the people who had stood before her in courtroom 3A with those same marks. She had seen them but never truly felt them until now. The metal had left not just bruises but a kind of imprint, a reminder that humiliation lingered even when the cuffs were gone. Hours passed in fragments. The cries of the newly arrested, the steady hum of phones ringing at the desk, the metallic scrape of doors opening and closing. Nia tried to meditate, focusing on her breath the way she had been taught years ago, but her mind refused to still. Instead, it replayed every detail of her arrest. She thought about the way Hayes had dismissed her permits without even reading them. The way he said, "you people," as though she were part of some faceless horde. The way he assumed his uniform made him the law itself, immune to scrutiny. She thought, too, about her courtroom, about the defendants who had come before her, claiming officers lied or exaggerated. She had always listened, always weighed their words carefully, but she also knew how hard it was to fight against the weight of a uniform. Tonight she had lived that imbalance, and she understood more deeply than ever how powerless it made people feel. At some point, Tasha drifted into a restless sleep on the bench. Nia remained awake. She wasn't exhausted so much as sharpened, every nerve, every thought heightened by the injustice of the day. She began quietly cataloging everything Hayes had said, every action he had taken, not just as a memory, but as evidence. She knew the law as well as anyone in the state. She knew the statutes on unlawful arrest, excessive force, deprivation of rights. She knew the weight of fabricated charges. She knew the channels of accountability. Hayes thought she was powerless in this cell, but Nia knew better. This was not the end of the story. Near dawn, footsteps returned, heavier this time. Keys rattled and the door to her cell creaked open. A familiar figure appeared, Detective Andre Coleman. His eyes widened when he saw her sitting on the bench, posture straight, gaze steady. "Judge Robinson?" he whispered, his voice hushed but sharp with disbelief. Nia stood, smoothing her dress. "Good morning, Detective." He stepped closer, lowering his voice even more. "What in the world are you doing here?" "Officer Hayes arrested me," Nia said evenly. "Claimed my permits were fake. Claimed I resisted. None of which is true." Andre's jaw tightened. He rubbed his hand across his face, muttering under his breath. "Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable." Nia held his gaze. "It may be unbelievable, but it is not uncommon. You and I both know that." Andre exhaled slowly, torn between outrage and shame. "He doesn't know who you are, does he?" Nia shook her head. "Either he doesn't or he's pretending not to. He booked me as Jane Doe." Andre's fists clenched. "That's not incompetence. That's deliberate. He's buying time, hoping this disappears before Monday." "Exactly," Nia said. "But it won't disappear, not this time." Andre hesitated, then said carefully, "Judge, I can make calls. I can get you out of here right now. We don't have to wait for the process to play out." Nia shook her head firmly. "No. I want to see this through. I want to feel what my defendants feel. I want to experience what they experience. Because if I walk out of here tonight, I learn nothing. But if I stay, I see the truth for myself." Andre stared at her for a long moment, then nodded, his respect deepening. "You're going to burn the whole department down over this, aren't you?" "Not burn," Nia corrected. "Rebuild, but yes." Hayes lit a match. Andre's expression hardened. "Then I'll make sure he doesn't smother it." With that, he left, his footsteps echoing away. The cell door clanged shut again, leaving Nia in the pale light of morning, her body weary but her mind sharpened into steel. The long night had taken its toll, but it had also crystallized her resolve. She was no longer just a judge observing injustice from the bench. She was a citizen who had lived it, breathed it, endured it. And that made her more dangerous to Hayes and to the culture that enabled him than ever before. The sun rose slowly outside, painting the city in gold. Inside the holding cell, Nia Robinson sat straighter than ever, ready for the day that would begin her fight. The morning sun crept slowly through the grimy station windows, throwing pale streaks across the booking desk. The overnight chaos had quieted into the uneasy hum of paperwork and fatigue. Officers shuffled between desks, sipping burnt coffee, muttering about long shifts. The holding cells, however, remained restless. Prisoners coughed, muttered, or rattled against the bars. Nia Robinson sat upright on the narrow bench, every muscle taut with resolve. She had made it through the long night without sleep, her dignity intact. The faces of those she had spoken with, Tasha, the young woman charged with prostitution, the men who muttered angrily about trumped-up charges, the drunk who sobbed into his hands, stayed with her. These were not just defendants on a docket anymore. They were neighbors, citizens, lives bruised by arrogance in uniform. And she was one of them now. The clang of boots echoed in the corridor. The desk sergeant, a tired man named Whitmore with thinning hair and deep creases etched into his face, shuffled toward the cells with a clipboard. His routine was methodical: check names, verify charges, prepare the morning arraignment list. He stopped in front of Nia's cell and peered down at his sheet. "Jane Doe," he called flatly. "Step forward." Nia stood calmly, hands folded in front of her. Her expression was serene, but inside her heart thudded once, not with fear, but with anticipation. The sergeant squinted. "Need your full name for the record. Can't send you up without it." She met his eyes. "My name is Nia Robinson." The syllables hung in the stale air. The sergeant blinked, his pen halting mid-scratch. For a moment, he seemed not to register what she'd said. Then the recognition hit. His face drained of color. His pen clattered to the floor. "Robinson?" he repeated, voice trembling. "As in Judge Robinson." A murmur rippled through the officers nearby. Heads turned. A young patrolman dropped his coffee, the brown liquid splattering across paperwork. Another officer muttered a curse under his breath. From the far side of the room, Detective Andre Coleman strode forward, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp. He had been waiting for this moment. "Yes," Nia said evenly, her voice carrying the authority she wielded every morning in courtroom 3A. "Chief Municipal Judge Nia Robinson, that is who I am." The room froze. The clatter of typewriters, the buzz of phones, even the shuffle of paperwork seemed to stop. For one long, charged moment, the only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights. Then chaos erupted. "Holy hell," an officer whispered. "That's the judge." "You mean the judge who does arraignments? The one the DA's office is always talking about?" "That's her. That's Robinson." The sergeant stumbled backward, his clipboard tumbling to the floor. "Judge Robinson, I had no idea." "Of course you didn't," Nia replied, her voice calm but cutting. "Because I was processed not as myself, but as Jane Doe, by Officer Hayes." At the sound of his name, Derek Hayes appeared from a side corridor, his face flushed, jaw tight. He had been watching the morning routine with feigned nonchalance, but now his carefully constructed mask began to crack. "What's going on here?" he barked, though his voice carried less confidence than the day before. "She resisted arrest, gave me fake permits. I did everything by the book." Andre stepped forward, his presence commanding. "By the book? Hayes, you booked the chief municipal judge under a false name. You cuffed her, humiliated her, and left her in holding all night. You call that by the book?" Hayes's eyes flicked nervously around the room, gauging the reactions of his colleagues. Some avoided his gaze, others glared openly. The tide was shifting, and he knew it. "I didn't know who she was," Hayes said defensively, his voice rising. "She was just another vendor with an attitude. I don't have time to check every—" "You had her identification," Nia interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "You had valid permits. You had notarized paperwork. You chose to dismiss it because of what you saw, not what was true." Her words struck like hammer blows. Hayes flinched. Andre turned to the sergeant. "Get her out of that cell, now." The keys rattled. The door swung open. For the first time in nearly 24 hours, Nia stepped out, her spine straight, her head high. The marks on her wrists were still raw, but she carried herself with the poise of the bench. The room was silent as she passed. Officers who had laughed at Hayes's story the night before now shifted uncomfortably, their shame visible. Some looked down. Others watched her with awe. She stopped in front of Hayes, her eyes steady. "You told me to tell it to the judge," she said quietly. "You never imagined the judge was standing in front of you." Gasps rippled through the station. Hayes's face darkened. His mouth opened, then closed again. No words came. Andre stepped closer to him, his voice low but sharp. "You just put your career in a coffin, Hayes, and you nailed it shut yourself." The sergeant cleared his throat nervously, looking to Nia. "Judge Robinson, please understand, we didn't know." "This isn't about what you knew," Nia replied. "It's about what you assumed, and it's about what you ignored." Her words were deliberate, each syllable aimed not just at Hayes, but at the entire room. She wanted them to feel the weight of the truth. That authority without accountability corrodes justice itself. As she walked toward the exit, escorted now not as a prisoner but with the deference she was owed, whispers followed her. "That's the judge who runs arraignments. She sat in holding all night because Hayes thought she was just another vendor. This is going to blow up the whole department." Outside, the sunlight hit her face as she stepped into the plaza. Reporters swarmed instantly, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. "Judge Robinson, is it true you were arrested yesterday? Do you plan to press charges against Officer Hayes? What does this mean for the court system?" Nia didn't answer yet. She stood still for a moment, breathing in the fresh air, feeling the freedom of open space after the suffocating night behind bars. Then she spoke, her voice steady, her words chosen with surgical precision. "I was arrested unlawfully. I was humiliated, handcuffed, and held overnight. Not because I broke the law, but because an officer assumed I did not belong. That assumption is the very problem we face in this city, and I intend to address it in the proper forum, through the proper channels, with the full weight of the law." The crowd erupted with questions, shouts, flashes. But Nia moved forward with Andre at her side, every step measured. Behind her, inside the station, Hayes stood frozen, surrounded by his colleagues. For the first time in his career, he realized that his laughter, his arrogance, his abuse of power had not been dismissed or forgotten. It had been witnessed, it had been documented, and it had been turned against him. The revelation had come, and with it the reckoning was now inevitable. The news broke like a thunderclap, and by mid-morning it had drowned out every other headline in the city. "Municipal Chief Judge arrested as street vendor," flashed across TV screens in bold red banners. Local news cut into scheduled programming, anchors barely able to hide their disbelief as they recounted how Judge Nia Robinson, the woman who presided daily over arraignments in courtroom 3A, had spent the night in a holding cell after being roughed up and cuffed by Officer Derek Hayes. The footage from cell phones outside the jewelry table surfaced within hours. The shaky video showed Hayes towering over Nia, barking orders, his hand gripping her arm as she tried to keep her composure. Though grainy, the sound was clear. His threats, his mocking tone, the venom in his words. Another angle caught him pushing her toward the cruiser, her permits scattering on the wind. What once had been dismissed by officers as routine procedure now burned across screens as undeniable evidence of arrogance and bias. By noon, the courthouse steps had become a sea of people. Protesters filled the plaza, their voices carrying up to the marble columns, as if demanding justice from the very building itself. Some carried handmade signs, "Justice for Judge Robinson," "No badge above the law," "We are all Nia." Others chanted in unison, their rhythm echoing down Fayetteville Street. "Whose court? Our court. Whose law? Our law." The crowd wasn't limited to activists. Business owners left shops to join. College students skipped classes. Clergy linked arms at the front lines, their clerical collars stark against protest banners. Even off-duty public defenders, paralegals, and courthouse clerks spilled into the plaza, still in their work clothes. They knew Judge Robinson not as a distant name, but as a daily presence, the calm, fair authority behind the bench. Inside City Hall, the mayor paced her office, the blinds drawn against the commotion outside. Every call she had taken since dawn carried the same message: outrage. The governor's office wanted answers. Civil rights groups were demanding an emergency response. National networks had already dispatched correspondents. She had dealt with scandals before, but this one felt different. This wasn't a nameless victim lost in the machinery of injustice. This was the face of the judiciary itself, humiliated on a public sidewalk. Her chief of staff laid down a stack of printouts, headlines pulled from across the nation. Police officer arrests sitting judge without cause. Humiliation on Main Street. A city confronts its bias. Judge Robinson incident sparks calls for reform. "This will define your administration if we don't act decisively," the chief of staff warned. The mayor pressed her fingers against her temples. "Then we act. Draft me a statement. Full condemnation. No hedging. The people need to know where I stand." Meanwhile, at police headquarters, chaos reigned. Captain Brett Collins sat at the long oak table in the department's conference room, flanked by senior officers and legal advisors. A TV mounted on the wall replayed the footage again and again. Every time Hayes's mocking voice rang out, the captain's jaw tightened. "This is a disaster," Collins muttered, though the word felt far too small. Internal Affairs investigator Latoya Harris leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "Disaster doesn't cover it. We have a veteran officer who manhandled the chief municipal judge, on tape. And worse, he tried to bury her identity. Do you understand what that looks like? It looks like systemic cover-up. This isn't just Hayes's problem anymore. It's ours." Another officer slammed his fist against the table. "He embarrassed the entire department. How are citizens supposed to trust us after this?" Collins glared at him. "Trust? Citizens haven't trusted us for years. This just ripped the mask off. Hayes didn't humiliate just Robinson. He humiliated all of us. And he handed every critic of this department a loaded weapon." Silence settled. They all knew he was right. At the same time, inside the courthouse, judges gathered in chambers for an emergency meeting. The air was thick with tension. Some wore outrage openly, their voices sharp. Others were quieter, shaken by the implications. Judge Emily Sanchez broke the silence. "This is beyond disrespect. If a sitting judge can be dismissed, mocked, and jailed on false charges, then the very foundation of judicial independence is under attack. Our court cannot function in a city where officers treat judges as nuisances." Another judge added, "It's not just about us. If this can happen to her, what about defendants without titles, without robes? This shines a light on everything we've tried to ignore for years." Heads nodded around the room. There was no dissent. What Hayes had done was indefensible. The only question now was how far they were willing to go to ensure it never happened again. By late afternoon, the protests had swelled to thousands. The courthouse plaza resembled a rally more than a demonstration. Loudspeakers carried chants. Musicians with drums beat out rhythms that echoed off glass towers. Lawyers in suits stood beside teenagers with homemade cardboard signs. The unity was striking. Reporters broadcast live, their voices nearly drowned by the chants. "This is the largest gathering Raleigh has seen in decades. Citizens of every background are here demanding accountability after Judge Robinson's shocking arrest. The sense of outrage is palpable, but so is the sense of solidarity." A woman with gray hair and a church hat stood at the microphone during an impromptu rally. "This isn't just about a judge. This is about every black woman who's been told she doesn't belong. About every man stopped and frisked for walking while black. About every kid thrown against a wall because an officer decided they looked guilty. Today, they picked the wrong woman, and now we all rise with her. Cheers erupted, chants resuming with greater force. Inside his apartment, Derek Hayes watched the chaos unfold on his TV. His uniform shirt lay crumpled on the floor, his badge tucked inside a drawer. His phone buzzed non-stop, texts from colleagues telling him to keep quiet, voicemails from reporters demanding comment, messages from strangers calling him every insult imaginable. He slammed the phone down and muttered bitterly, "They're making me the villain. I was just doing my job." But even as he said it, he knew the words rang hollow. He remembered her steady eyes as she said, "Tell it to the judge." He hadn't known then that she was the judge, but the memory haunted him nonetheless. For the first time in 15 years, Derek Hayes felt real fear. Not the fear of physical harm, but the fear of consequences. Consequences that his badge could no longer shield him from. As night fell, the mayor stepped onto the steps of City Hall, flanked by clergy, community leaders, and members of the city council. Bright floodlights illuminated her face as cameras zoomed in. "What happened to Judge Robinson is unacceptable," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of thousands of eyes upon her. "This is not about titles. This is about humanity. Every citizen, from the most powerful to the most vulnerable, deserves dignity and respect from those sworn to protect them. Officer Hayes failed in that duty, and the system failed to stop him sooner." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but the mayor raised her hand, silencing them. "Words alone are not enough. Tonight, I am announcing an independent review of the police department, led by a civilian panel with full authority to recommend reforms. Officer Hayes has been suspended without pay pending investigation, and we will not rest until accountability is achieved. This city deserves better. We will be better." The crowd roared again, but this time the sound was mixed with hope as well as anger. For the first time since the incident, people felt the possibility of change. Back in her chambers, Nia Robinson sat quietly, watching the broadcast on a muted television. She had been home only briefly, showered, changed, and returned to the courthouse where she felt most herself. She had declined every interview request, every invitation to stand at the protests. Her time to speak would come, but tonight she wanted the people's voices to lead. Monique, her longtime secretary, entered softly. "They're all out there for you," she said. "The whole city. But you're just sitting here?" Nia smiled faintly. "This isn't about me, Monique. It's about what I represent. If I step out now, it becomes personal. If I wait, it becomes institutional." Monique studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then when you speak, it will shake the ground." Nia turned back to the window. Outside, the chants carried through the night air, swelling, unyielding. The reckoning had begun, and tomorrow she would decide how to use it. For 2 days after her release from the holding cell, Judge Nia Robinson remained silent. The city buzzed with speculation, the media churned out headlines by the hour, and protests grew larger each night. Yet she gave no interviews, released no statements, and issued no press conferences. Her silence became its own kind of presence, looming larger with every passing hour. Citizens argued in barbershops, in grocery store aisles, on public buses. "Why hasn't she spoken yet?" some asked impatiently. Others, more familiar with her reputation for discipline, nodded knowingly. "She'll speak when the time is right." That moment came on the third evening. The courthouse auditorium had been opened to the public, and it filled quickly. Judges, lawyers, city officials, reporters, activists, students, and everyday citizens crowded into the seats. Hundreds more stood outside in the plaza, where loudspeakers had been set up to broadcast her words. Television crews filled the aisles, their cameras pointed at the podium that stood center stage beneath a seal of justice. The air was electric with anticipation. Conversations buzzed in low tones until at precisely 7 p.m. the side door opened. Judge Nia Robinson entered. She wore her robe, not the navy dress from the street corner, not the suit she had worn in chambers the past 2 days, but the garment that symbolized her role, It was a deliberate choice. She had been humiliated as a woman on a sidewalk, but tonight she stood as the chief municipal judge, the embodiment of fairness in the city's courts. The audience rose to their feet in a wave of respect. Cameras flashed. Chants outside shifted instantly into cheers. She walked to the podium with measured steps, her face composed, her presence commanding. When she reached the microphone, she placed both hands firmly on the wooden sides, scanning the crowd before her. She let the silence stretch, a silence so deep it felt sacred before speaking her first words. 2 nights ago, she began, her voice calm yet resonant, I was handcuffed and placed in a holding cell, not because I broke a law, not because I posed a threat, but because of an assumption. The words echoed through the auditorium. Outside, the plaza fell quiet, the crowd straining to hear every syllable through the speakers. An officer of the law saw me on a sidewalk and decided that I did not belong. He dismissed my permits. He ignored my explanation. He grabbed my arm and forced me into a patrol car. He treated me not as a citizen with rights, but as a nuisance to be removed. And when I asked for fairness, he gave me laughter. Gasps rippled across the room. Reporters scribbled furiously. The cameras zoomed closer. That laughter, she continued, was not about me as an individual. It was about what he thought I wasn't. It was about who he decided I could never be. And for a night, he succeeded in stripping away everything but my humanity. I was not Judge Robinson. I was not a respected public servant. I was simply a black woman in a cell. Her voice trembled slightly, not with fear but with conviction. And that, she said, her tone sharpening, is the very heart of the problem we face. She paused, scanning the sea of faces. The silence was profound, heavy with shared recognition. I stand before you now not to ask for sympathy. My dignity does not depend on one officer's behavior. My dignity is intact. What I stand before you to say is this. If it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. And if it can happen to anyone, then justice itself is in danger. A murmur of agreement rolled through the auditorium. Outside, chants began to rise softly, echoing her words. This incident is not about a single man. It is about a culture where arrogance replaces authority, a culture where mockery substitutes for respect, a culture where bias goes unchecked and dignity is treated as optional. She leaned slightly forward, her eyes narrowing with resolve. That culture cannot stand. The applause erupted like thunder. People rose to their feet, clapping, shouting, chanting. The sound shook the windows of the auditorium. Nia raised her hand gently and the room quieted again. I have been asked why I remained silent for 2 days, why I did not run to microphones, why I let the protests speak for me. My answer is simple. I wanted the truth to breathe. I wanted the world to see this for what it was, not for what I claimed it to be. Because this is bigger than me. This is about trust, the trust between citizens and those sworn to protect them. That trust has been broken, and it must be rebuilt. Her words were deliberate, paced, each phrase striking with precision. I am calling for accountability, not just for Officer Hayes, but for the culture that enabled him. I am calling for transparency in how complaints against officers are handled. I am calling for oversight that is not internal, but civilian. And I am calling for training that does not merely teach tactics, but teaches humanity. The applause swelled again, louder than before. Some shouted her name, others chanted, "Accountability now." She lifted her chin, her gaze sweeping the crowd. Let me be clear. This is not a call for vengeance. I do not seek to humiliate in return. What I seek is justice, true justice, the kind that protects the powerless as fiercely as the powerful, the kind that does not depend on titles or robes or positions, the kind that belongs to every citizen of this city. The audience was on its feet again, tears streaming down faces, fists raised high. Even some officers who had come in uniform stood clapping, their expressions solemn. Nia's voice softened, but her words cut sharper than ever. We cannot undo what happened to me, but we can ensure that what happened to me does not happen again. Not to me, not to you, not to anyone." She let that hang in the air, her eyes steady, her silence louder than any cheer. Then she finished, her voice steady, her tone unyielding. "Justice cannot survive arrogance. Justice cannot survive bias. Justice cannot survive laughter in the face of dignity. But justice will survive this because we will demand it, together." The roar that followed was deafening. People wept openly, embracing strangers beside them. Outside, the chants thundered, echoing off the courthouse walls. "Justice! Justice! Justice! We are all Nia!" Reporters scrambled to beam her words across the country. Editorialists already began drafting columns declaring it the Robinson Doctrine, a moment when silence turned into thunder and a city's conscience was laid bare. In the days that followed, her speech was replayed endlessly. Law schools studied it. Civil rights groups quoted it. Young people printed her words on posters and T-shirts. But inside the courthouse, after the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, Judge Nia Robinson sat quietly in her chambers, her robe folded neatly beside her. She had spoken not for herself, but for every citizen who had been dismissed, humiliated, or silenced. And she knew this was only the beginning. The morning after Judge Nia Robinson's speech, Raleigh's police department was a building under siege. The brick facade on Martin Street looked the same as it had for decades, but inside its walls the atmosphere was nothing short of combustible. The front steps were crowded with reporters who barked questions at every uniform that walked in or out. Protesters camped across the street, holding signs that read, "Fire Hayes now," and "Justice for all, not just some." Every squad car that rolled through the gates was met with chants of accountability. Inside, the mood was equally hostile, not between protesters and police, but within the ranks themselves. At 9 a.m., a closed-door meeting convened on the second floor in the largest conference room. Captain Brett Collins presided at the head of the long oak table. His jaw was clenched, his eyes ringed with fatigue. He had been on the phone with city leaders until dawn, fielding demands from the mayor, the governor's office, and even calls from national law enforcement organizations. Now the department's senior staff sat before him, their uniforms immaculate, their expressions taut with dread. A TV on the wall played muted clips of Judge Robinson's speech from the night before. Even without sound, her presence radiated authority, her words scrolling in bold captions. "If it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone." Collins slammed his fist on the table. "Do you understand the magnitude of what's happened here? We don't just have a rogue officer, we don't just have a bad arrest. We have the chief municipal judge, the face of this city's courtroom system, roughed up and paraded into holding like a common criminal, and we have it on video." He looked around the table, daring anyone to minimize the crisis. No one spoke. LaToya Harris, head of internal affairs, finally broke the silence. "We've already pulled Hayes's file. What we found isn't pretty." She dropped a thick folder onto the table with a thud. The pages inside were dense with reports, complaints, and disciplinary memos. "Over the last 15 years, she said, flipping the folder open, Hayes has been the subject of no fewer than 36 citizen complaints. Excessive force, disrespectful conduct, unlawful detainment, even falsifying details in reports. Most were dismissed as unsubstantiated." "Because he's careful," muttered Lieutenant Mark Dawson, a veteran who had served alongside Hayes for years. "He never left enough evidence to stick." LaToya's eyes narrowed. "Or because the culture in this department protected him. Let's not pretend otherwise. These complaints weren't magic tricks. People filed them, and they were ignored." The words landed heavily. A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. For years they had laughed at Hayes's arrogance, tolerated his outbursts, excused his misconduct as just Hayes being Hayes. Now those indulgences had turned toxic, poisoning not just him, but the department's credibility. Collins pinched the bridge of his nose. "The governor's office wants a full report within 72 hours. They're not playing around. and the mayor's civilian review panel is already drafting subpoenas. A ripple of unease moved through the room. For a police department long accustomed to handling its business internally, the thought of outside oversight was anathema. But no one could deny that this time they had no choice. Meanwhile, in a small office down the hall, Derek Hayes sat hunched in a chair, stripped of his badge, his weapon locked away in an evidence safe. The walls seemed to close in around him. He had been ordered to remain in the building until further notice, his status officially suspended pending investigation. He watched the clock tick, each minute dragging like an hour. His phone buzzed constantly. Calls from union reps, messages from his lawyer, texts from colleagues telling him to hold tight. But he felt none of the camaraderie that had once defined his career. Where there had once been nods of respect and laughter at his crude jokes, now there were glares, whispers, avoidance. He thought of the night he grabbed Robinson's arm, the way she'd straightened her shoulders and stared him down. He had assumed she was bluffing, just another street vendor talking bigger than her station. Now he knew the truth. She had been looking at him not as a victim but as a witness, cataloging every word, every action, storing it like evidence. For the first time, Hayes felt the weight of consequences pressing on his chest. Back in the conference room, LaToya Harris continued her presentation. This incident has forced us to re-examine not just Hayes, but the culture that allowed him to thrive. We've cross-referenced his complaints with patrol logs. We've identified patterns. He disproportionately targeted street vendors, unhoused individuals, and young black men. He used vague justifications, suspicious behavior, non-compliance to cover his tracks. And he filed reports that didn't match the accounts of witnesses. Judge Robinson's arrest, she explained, had triggered a cascade of new testimonies. Citizens emboldened by her courage were coming forward with stories of Hayes's misconduct. A food truck operator recalled being ticketed multiple times by Hayes despite valid permits. A college student described being handcuffed for talking back during a traffic stop. An elderly man recounted Hayes laughing at him after a stop and frisk yielded nothing. The stories poured in, each one chipping away at the department's defenses. "We are facing a reckoning," LaToya said bluntly, "and it won't stop at Hayes. The public is demanding answers. They want to know who else ignored these complaints, who else let them disappear. We can't just throw Hayes under the bus. We have to admit the system failed." Murmurs of discontent spread around the table. For many, admitting systemic failure was unthinkable. But silence was no longer an option. The police union tried to mount a defense. That afternoon, their spokesperson stood at a podium, flanked by uniformed officers. "Officer Hayes is a 15-year veteran," the spokesperson declared. "He has served this city with dedication and courage. While we respect Judge Robinson, we urge the public not to rush to judgment based on incomplete information. We will fight to ensure Officer Hayes receives fair treatment." The statement fell flat. Reporters grilled the spokesperson with pointed questions. "Are you denying the video evidence? How do you explain the 36 complaints? Do you believe it's fair treatment to cuff a sitting judge with valid permits?" The spokesperson stammered, deflected, and eventually retreated from the podium. The image of police defending Hayes while the public demanded accountability only deepened the outrage. Inside the department, fault lines widened. Some officers muttered that Hayes had been reckless, that he had brought shame on all of them. Others, particularly younger recruits, whispered that maybe Judge Robinson was right, maybe the culture really was broken. For the first time in years, cracks appeared in the blue wall of silence. Detective Andre Coleman watched it all unfold with grim satisfaction. He had warned colleagues for years about Hayes's arrogance, his pattern of disrespect. Now the world was listening and change felt possible, but he also knew it would come at a steep price. That night, as protests outside the station grew louder, chants echoing off the walls, Andre walked past Hayes's office. Through the glass window, he saw the man who once strutted with smug authority now slumped at his desk, his head in his hands. For a fleeting moment, Andre almost felt pity. Almost. But then he remembered Nia Robinson's wrists, red and raw from the cuffs. He remembered her calm voice saying, "This is not about me. This is about every citizen who has been dismissed, humiliated, or silenced." And the pity vanished. By the end of the week, the department was a city under siege within a city. Internal affairs worked around the clock, subpoenas poured in, and the mayor's civilian review board began interviewing citizens. Hayes's name was no longer just a scandal, it was a symbol. For decades, the department had operated with a veneer of authority, confident in its ability to weather criticism. But Judge Robinson's arrest had stripped away the veneer, exposing the rot beneath. The crisis was no longer about one man's arrogance. It was about a culture, and cultures, once exposed, do not heal quietly. They demand confrontation, and confrontation was coming. By the weekend, Raleigh had changed. The courthouse steps, once a place where defendants smoked nervously before arraignments and lawyers hurried in with case files, had become the epicenter of something larger than any trial. The plaza was no longer quiet marble and muted conversations. It pulsed with life, with rage, with hope. Thousands poured into downtown. Entire families arrived together, grandparents in folding chairs, parents with toddlers on their shoulders, teenagers carrying signs made of cardboard and paint. College students marched in groups, their chants bouncing between the glass facades of the skyscrapers. Church choirs sang freedom hymns on the corner, their harmonies carrying above the din of traffic. Food vendors parked along the blocks, feeding the crowds as if preparing for a festival. But this wasn't celebration, it was outrage turned into motion. The chants were constant, rising and falling like waves. "No badge above the law. We are all Nia. Justice, justice, justice." National networks transformed the courthouse plaza into their broadcast hub. CNN ran continuous coverage under the banner, "Judge arrested unlawfully." MSNBC carried live interviews with protesters. Even Fox News, careful in its framing, acknowledged the crisis as a national flashpoint on police authority. Drone cameras hovered above the throngs, capturing aerial views of a sea of people filling every street in a 4-block radius. The images played on repeat, thousands of voices, signs waving, fists raised. Local anchors leaned into the microphone with urgency. What began as a routine Saturday has now become a movement. Citizens across this city and beyond are saying enough is enough. Social media amplified everything. Hashtags surged. "Ner justice for Nia, mer bias in blue, ner if it happens to her." TikTok videos stitched footage of Hayes's aggression with Judge Robinson's calm, steady voice from her speech. Twitter feeds flooded with personal stories, people sharing their own humiliations at the hands of arrogant officers. One post went viral, a photo of Nia's scattered jewelry permits lying on the sidewalk after her arrest, captioned, "The papers were valid, the system wasn't." Within hours, it had been shared hundreds of thousands of times. At the heart of the uproar were not politicians or activists, but ordinary people who saw themselves in Nia Robinson. A local barber, Marcus Reed, set up a folding chair on the plaza and cut hair for free, his clippers buzzing between chants. "I want people to remember," he told a reporter, "that this isn't just about one woman. It's about every black man who's been told to get out of his car for no reason. Every kid frisked walking home from school. Judge Robinson just proved what we've always known. Respect isn't given equally." A retired school teacher, Mrs. Louise Palmer, held a handwritten sign that read, "I taught her students. She taught me dignity." Tears ran down her cheeks as she told a camera, "If they can laugh at her, they'll laugh at all of us, but not anymore." College students painted murals overnight on plywood boards protecting downtown shops. One mural depicted Judge Robinson standing tall, her robe flowing like armor, while a shadowy officer tried and failed to pull her down. Across the mural, in bold letters, "Dignity doesn't kneel." Sunday morning, clergy turned the plaza into an open-air pulpit. Ministers, priests, rabbis, and imams stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices blending in unity. Reverend Samuel Jackson of Mount Zion Baptist raised his Bible and thundered, "The prophets told us long ago, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Judge Robinson's dignity has shown us the stream is blocked, and we are here to tear down that dam." The crowd roared, repeating the words back. Imam Kareem Abdullah spoke next, his tone calmer but no less powerful. "Justice is not justice if it can be mocked. Faith is not faith if we stay silent. Today we join our voices with hers." Among the protesters was a familiar face to Nia, Tasha Brown, the young woman she had met in the holding cell. She stood nervously at the edge of the crowd, clutching a hastily written sign. "I was arrested too. I wasn't guilty either." A local news crew noticed her. The reporter, recognizing the raw honesty in her words, pulled her aside for an interview. Tasha's voice trembled as she spoke. "They said I was a prostitute. I was just walking home from work. I didn't even know what to say when they cuffed me. But when I saw Judge Robinson in that cell, I realized this happens to everybody, even her. So I came here because if she can stand up, I can too." The clip aired that evening, and by Monday morning, Tasha's words were everywhere. For many viewers, it was the first time they saw not just the humiliation of a judge, but the humiliation of countless ordinary citizens reflected in her story. While the city roared, Derek Hayes hid. Confined to his apartment under administrative suspension, he watched the protests on TV with mounting dread. Every chant, every sign felt like a personal attack. His name was plastered across headlines, "Officer Hayes under fire." Protesters had even begun carrying posters with his face crossed out in red. He tried to tell himself he was the victim of a witch hunt, that he was being scapegoated for a single bad moment. But the avalanche of complaints pouring into the department, citizens describing years of humiliation at his hands, shredded his narrative. He opened his front door once to find a flyer taped to it. In bold black letters, "We don't forget." For the first time in his career, Hayes realized the badge no longer protected him. It exposed him. By the following week, the uproar had transcended Raleigh. The New York Times ran a front-page article. "Judge's humiliation sparks national debate on policing and bias." The Washington Post published an editorial calling Nia Robinson the Rosa Parks of judicial integrity. Civil rights groups across the country issued statements of solidarity. CNN hosted a primetime panel with legal scholars who called it a crisis of legitimacy for law enforcement. Clips of Judge Robinson's speech were replayed with dramatic emphasis. "If it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone." And across social media, her words were turned into hashtags, memes, graphics, even songs. In City Hall, pressure mounted on the mayor and city council. Petitions with tens of thousands of signatures demanded Hayes's termination and broader reform. Council members were flooded with calls, emails, and letters. One councilwoman remarked privately, "I haven't seen this kind of civic engagement in 20 years. People who never cared about city politics before are showing up to meetings with hand-painted signs. We can't ignore this." What stunned many observers wasn't just the uproar, but how it had been ignited. It wasn't an act of violence or a mass tragedy. It was silence, the dignified silence of a judge who refused to be broken, who endured humiliation without rage, and who later spoke with clarity instead of vengeance. That silence became the movement's symbol. Posters appeared with her image, eyes calm, mouth closed, above the words, "Dignity speaks louder." By the end of the second week, Raleigh was no longer the same city. Protesters still filled the plaza daily. Media trucks lined the streets. City officials whispered of resignations. Hayes was on the brink of dismissal, and Judge Nia Robinson had become more than a jurist. She had become a symbol of injustice endured, of dignity reclaimed, of a community's refusal to be silenced. The uproar had not died down. It had only grown, and everyone knew the next step would decide whether it ended in real reform or just another scar on the city's history. The protests thundered outside the courthouse for days, a storm of voices that refused to die down. Yet inside her chambers, Judge Nia Robinson sat in stillness, surrounded by the order and quiet of her bookshelves, her files, her desk stacked with case briefs. To the untrained eye, she appeared calm, even detached. But within her, a fire burned, steady, controlled, and unshakable. She had lived through humiliation. She had endured the cold cell, the jeers of officers, the bruising pressure of metal cuffs. She had felt what it was to be stripped of authority, reduced to a stereotype, dismissed without consideration. But she had also felt something else: resilience, a deep, unbreakable sense of self that no officer, no badge, no false report could erase. Now the question was simple but enormous: how to channel that resilience into something larger. On a quiet Saturday morning before the courthouse opened, Nia slipped out for a walk through the very streets where she had been arrested. The jewelry table was gone, of course, the folding legs folded up weeks ago after her sisters flew past. But in its place, chalk markings from protesters covered the concrete. Some had written, "Justice lives here." Others had drawn scales, tilted deliberately off balance. She stopped, looking down at the ground where Hayes had scattered her permits. She remembered the sting in her arm when he gripped her, the laughter in his voice when he called her lady. But instead of anger, what she felt now was clarity. This spot was no longer only a place of humiliation. It had become the birthplace of something bigger, a reckoning her city could no longer ignore. Later that day, she met with Tasha Brown in her chambers. The young woman looked nervous, her hands fidgeting in her lap as she sat across from the massive oak desk. "You didn't have to come," Nia said gently, pouring her guest a glass of water. Tasha shook her head. "No, I did. After the interview, people started reaching out to me, strangers, telling me they'd been through the same thing. I don't even know how to handle it." "You handle it by telling the truth," Nia replied. "That's what you did, and that's what matters." Tasha's eyes searched hers. "How did you stay so calm? When he grabbed you, when he lied about you, how did you not just explode?" Nia leaned back, her hands folded neatly on the desk. "Because anger can be dismissed. Calm cannot. When you hold your ground with dignity, you force people to see you. They may not admit it, but they see you. And that is power." Tasha absorbed the words, nodding slowly. "So what happens now? To him? To the police?" Nia's expression hardened slightly. "That depends on us, on whether we let this moment fade into memory or whether we turn it into reform. The protests are powerful, but change must be more than noise. It must be policy, structure, accountability." For the first time since her arrest, Nia allowed herself to speak not just as a judge, but as a strategist. And Tasha listened, wide-eyed, realizing she was sitting not just across from a courtroom authority, but from a woman intent on reshaping the very system itself. Behind the scenes, Nia began reaching out. She met with trusted colleagues, fellow judges, civil rights attorneys, community leaders. In hushed conversations, she laid out her vision: a civilian oversight board with teeth, mandatory bias training for officers, and a requirement that all citizen complaints be logged and reviewed by independent counsel. Some warned her that the police union would resist. Others reminded her of the political backlash that awaited. But Nia listened calmly, nodding. Resistance is inevitable. Backlash is inevitable. But silence is no longer possible. Not after this, her colleagues knew she was right. At night, when the courthouse emptied and the plaza outside filled with chants, Nia would sit at her window and watch the crowd. Sometimes she recognized faces she had seen in her courtroom, defendants, lawyers, even jurors. To see them now, marching not in fear but in solidarity, moved her deeply. Yet she also felt the burden of expectation pressing on her shoulders. She was no longer just a judge. She had become a symbol, And symbols, once elevated, are rarely allowed to rest. She thought often of her parents. Her father, a steelworker, had always told her, "Dignity is the one thing no one can take from you unless you hand it over." Her mother, a school teacher, had taught her the power of words, of patience, of holding silence until it became undeniable. Both lessons had carried her through that night in holding. Now they guided her as she planned the battles to come. Detective Andre Coleman visited her one evening after hours. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed by long days of internal tension at the department. "You've lit a fire," he said bluntly, dropping into the chair across from her desk. "Half the department wants Hayes gone yesterday. The other half is circling the wagons. It's tearing us apart." Naya studied him carefully. "And where do you stand?" Andre gave a tired smile. "Where I've always stood. On the side of accountability. Hayes embarrassed us all, but more than that, he revealed us. The problem isn't just him. It's the shield he thought he had." She nodded. "That shield must be stripped away, but not just for him. For anyone who hides behind it," Andre sighed. "It won't be easy." "Nothing worth doing ever is," Nia replied. Soon, letters began to arrive at her chambers. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Some were from citizens thanking her for her courage. Others were from people recounting their own humiliations, their own false arrests, their own nights in holding cells. One letter, written in careful script on lined notebook paper, came from a 16-year-old boy. "Judge Robinson," it read, "when I saw what happened to you, I realized it wasn't just me. Last year, an officer cuffed me outside a gas station for no reason. I thought maybe I really did something wrong. But seeing you in cuffs made me see it was never about me. It was about them. Thank you for making me feel less invisible." Nia read the letter 3 times, her throat tight. She placed it gently in her desk drawer alongside others she knew she would keep forever. By the 3rd week, as the protests continued and the media spotlight remained fixed, Nia's path was clear. She could no longer simply preside from the bench. She had to lead beyond it. Her resolve was not born of ambition, but of duty. She had been given a rare, painful gift: perspective. She now understood the system not only from the bench, but from the cell. And that dual perspective gave her the authority to demand change with unmatched credibility. When she looked in the mirror each morning, she no longer saw only a judge in robes. She saw a woman who had endured the system at its worst and lived to demand its best. Late one night, Monique entered her chambers to find Nia still working, papers spread across her desk. "You haven't been home in 2 days, Monique scolded. "I'll rest later," Nia murmured, her eyes scanning drafts of proposed reforms. Monique shook her head, but her voice softened. "You're carrying the whole city on your shoulders, Judge. Don't forget to carry yourself, too." Nia looked up, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I'll be fine. Because this time, I'm not carrying it alone." "Look outside." Monique turned toward the window. Outside, even at midnight, the plaza still held clusters of protesters, their signs visible under street lamps, their chants rising faintly into the night. "They're carrying it with me," Nia whispered. The uproar had shaken the city, but Nia's resolve was what would decide its outcome. She had chosen silence when it mattered, speech when it counted, and now she chose action that would last. Her humiliation had not broken her, it had refined her. And as she prepared for the battles to come, against unions, against politics, against entrenched culture, she carried with her not just her own dignity, but the dignity of everyone who had ever been laughed at, cuffed, dismissed, or silenced. Because in the end, Nia Robinson's greatest power was not her robe, nor her bench, nor even her title. It was her resolve. By the 4th week, the storm that had begun with a single arrogant laugh had transformed Raleigh into a different city, What had started as outrage over Judge Nia Robinson's unlawful arrest was now a movement reshaping laws, institutions, and culture itself. The courthouse plaza, once filled with chants of protest, had become a forum for planning. Citizens no longer gathered simply to shout, but to organize. Community groups formed alliances, lawyers offered free counsel to those with past complaints, and pastors, imams, and rabbis set up tents where people could file testimonies on the spot. The air still vibrated with anger, but beneath it ran a steady current of determination. For Derek Hayes, the cultural shift meant the end of the world as he knew it. Internal Affairs released its preliminary report, and it was devastating. 36 complaints, long buried, were now pulled into the light. Each one was recounted in meticulous detail. The street vendor whose permits he dismissed, the college student he handcuffed for talking back, the elderly man who claimed Hayes had mocked him during a stop. Patterns of bias, intimidation, and arrogance were laid bare. When the mayor held a press conference announcing Hayes's termination, the crowd outside City Hall erupted in cheers. His badge and weapon had already been collected weeks earlier, but now it was official. He was no longer an officer of the law. Yet his fall didn't end there. Civil suits piled up, filed by citizens who had once been too afraid to speak. Lawyers who had laughed bitterly at his smug testimony in courtrooms now sharpened their pens to dismantle him in civil litigation. The man who had strutted through Raleigh's streets with unchecked authority was now a pariah, his name synonymous with disgrace. Inside his apartment, curtains drawn tight, Hayes watched the news clips of his own downfall. For years he had believed the uniform made him untouchable. Now he understood the truth. Arrogance had left him naked, exposed to a world that no longer tolerated his abuse. But the reckoning was never just about Hayes. It was about the system that had sheltered him. The mayor's civilian review board, once a symbolic gesture with little power, was given teeth. Its members, drawn from clergy, civil rights leaders, educators, and everyday citizens, now had full authority to investigate complaints, subpoena records, and recommend disciplinary action. For the first time in city history, accountability was not contained within the four walls of the department. Mandatory bias and de-escalation training was rolled out, not as a weekend seminar, but as a requirement tied to certification. Officers would sit through scenarios that forced them to confront their assumptions, their prejudices, their reflexes. Failure to complete the training meant loss of street duty. A new database was created, one accessible to the public, listing all complaints filed against officers and their resolutions. Transparency, once a dream whispered by activists, was now law. Inside courtroom 3A, Nia Robinson continued her daily duties, but the atmosphere was different. Defendants who once approached her bench with eyes downcast now looked up, some even smiling faintly. They had seen her humiliated and had seen her rise again. She was no longer just a judge. She was proof that dignity could withstand even the harshest blow. Lawyers treated her rulings with deeper respect, knowing her words carried the weight of lived experience. Court staff worked with renewed energy, proud to serve under her. Even officers entering her courtroom carried themselves differently, aware that the balance of power had shifted. One morning, during arraignments, a young man stood before her, charged with disorderly conduct. His eyes were wary, his body tense. "You stand accused of shouting at an officer," Nia said evenly, reviewing the charge. "Yes, Your Honor," he said cautiously, "but he shoved me first." "I just told him to stop." Nia studied him for a moment, then glanced at the officer's report. The wording was vague, almost identical to the reports she had once seen from Hayes. She looked back at the young man and spoke softly but firmly. "This court will not accept assumptions as evidence," she said. "Dismissed." A murmur rippled through the room. The young man's shoulders sagged in relief, and across the gallery, citizens nodded to one another. Courtroom 3A was no longer business as usual. It was justice rebuilt. For Tasha Brown, the young woman arrested the same night as Naya, the cultural shift was personal. Inspired by Judge Robinson's resilience, she began speaking at rallies, telling her story. What had once been shame became testimony. "I thought I was invisible," she told a crowd at Shaw University. "I thought no one would ever believe me. But when Judge Robinson stood up, I realized my voice mattered too, and so does yours." Her words resonated with students, sparking a campus movement demanding oversight and equity. Tasha, once just another young woman lost in the system, had become an activist in her own right, her confidence growing with every speech. Nia watched her with quiet pride, knowing that her ordeal had planted seeds in the next generation. The cultural shift rippled beyond the courthouse and police department. Churches held town halls on civic duty. Schools added lessons on constitutional rights. Neighborhood associations formed committees to monitor police activity in their communities. Even in casual conversations, in barbershops, grocery stores, park benches, citizens spoke differently about justice. Where once cynicism reigned, now there was cautious hope. People no longer shrugged and said, "That's just how it is." Instead, they said, "If it can happen to her, it can happen to anyone, and we won't let it." Raleigh was not alone. Other cities took notice. Editorials urged municipalities across the country to adopt similar reforms. Judge Robinson was invited to speak at law schools and conferences. Her ordeal cited in academic journals and civil rights discussions. Her speech, "If it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone," was replayed endlessly, now studied not only as testimony but as doctrine. The Robinson Doctrine, some called it, the idea that justice must be blind not only in theory but in practice, and that dignity cannot be conditional. Months later, Officer Hayes appeared at his own disciplinary hearing. No cameras were allowed, but word quickly leaked. He sat alone at a table, stripped of his badge, facing a panel of citizens and officials. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The verdict was swift, permanent dismissal, with referrals to state authorities for potential prosecution of misconduct. For Hayes, the fall was complete. For the city, it was closure. On the one-year anniversary of her arrest, the courthouse plaza once again filled with people. This time there were no angry chants, no shouted demands. Instead, there was music, speeches, and celebration. The reforms were in place. The review board was functioning. Transparency was law, and Judge Robinson stood before the crowd, her robe billowing in the spring breeze. "This city has proven something extraordinary," she said, her voice strong. "That humiliation can become dignity. That silence can become thunder. That justice, once broken, can be rebuilt. We are not perfect, but we are better, and we will keep fighting to be better still." The applause was thunderous, rolling across the plaza, echoing into the marble columns of the courthouse. Naya stepped back from the podium, her heart full but steady. She had endured the worst the system could do to her, and she had turned it into the best the system could become. The cultural shift was not complete, but it had begun, and it would not be stopped.